But now we're going to tackle a very big issue that I find is going to set a dangerous precedent in the United States. I keep talking about a domino effect, that if you give someone an inch, they will take a mile if they're greedy motherfuckers. And this administration, this regime is greedy motherfuckers personified. Picture in the fucking dictionary. So when it comes to the Supreme Court now, they're considering restricting and removing the legalities of gun owners who smoke weed on a regular basis. And this is so random, and someone will say this is random, but it's not random. It's not random in the slightest bit. They have flirted around the idea of removing the Second Amendment from certain groups of people. So when we talk about the Supreme Court currently right now, under consideration on whether people who regularly smoke pot can legally own guns, they're flirting with the idea of making sure that they can prejudicially restrict the rights of certain groups of people. This may not seem serious, but in a way, again, it is very serious, because one restriction on a categorized group of people can then lead to the restriction of other categorized groups of people, such as the LGBTQ plus community. And when that precedent is set, then that precedent can be unequally applied. So let's get into it today about the Supreme Court and the impact that this decision could have if they rule that everyday marijuana smokers cannot legally own guns. So, the Supreme Court is now considering whether regular marijuana users can legally own guns. And I think that's a dangerous precedent waiting to be set. If SCOTUS rules that marijuana users cannot legally own firearms, that decision will once again disproportionately affect Black and brown communities, the same communities that already receive harsher sentences and face more aggressive policing for the same crimes as their white counterparts. Once again, this corrupted court is using correlation to define causation, creating sweeping restrictions without evidence, logic, or accountability. And that's where today's conversation begins. Let's discuss gun violence, gun reform, and the true issue that safeguards the people who commit these heinous crimes that cause your children to be unalived. As well, let's talk about the real issue at contention here. Is it the guns? Or is it the criminals who use them? Or is it the justice system that excuses the criminal? Listen, criminals will always find access to guns. What criminals should not find access to are reduced sentences, political pardons, and more frequently, judicial biases. So, when we talk about the Second Amendment, people tend to forget that the U.S. Constitution wasn't written to give rights. It was written to protect rights that already belong to American citizens. And what's happening now, with the Supreme Court considering whether regular marijuana users can legally own guns, shows exactly how fragile that protection can become when politics starts mixing with constitutional interpretation. Our current administration has made it clear they are not here to protect all Americans. They want to control and imprison particular Americans through subconscious prejudice and unfair arbitrary policy. Here's the contradiction, though. So, under federal law, anyone who uses an unlawful controlled substance, which will include marijuana still, can be restricted from owning a gun. But marijuana isn't mentioned in the Constitution, right? So, it's a classification under the U.S. Code, not a constitutional clause. That means the issue technically falls to the states. And under the 10th Amendment, states have the authority to regulate laws not explicitly outlined in the Constitution. So, yes, that creates a contradiction. You have states legalizing marijuana, while the federal government still considers those same people unfit to own guns as they look to revisit this case. It's a direct clash between state sovereignty and federal oversight, and it exposes how inconsistent our justice system can be when it tries to police human behavior instead of protecting constitutional balance. So now let's talk about mental health, because this is a part. It is just as important and just as misunderstood. Mental health is a broad term used to describe people who suffer from brain chemistry abnormalities. Mental health can become a condition, but it can also happen to any human spontaneously. A mental health crisis sometimes isn't a permanent condition. It's an event. It's an event that can happen to anyone at any time. You can live your entire life without a diagnosis and suddenly experience a mental break because of trauma, grief, or stress can cause you a mental health crisis. So how do you legislate something that's situational, unpredictable, and honestly, human? You can't. Not without overreaching, not without turning the law into a weapon against groups of people who may never pose a threat. Using this categorization method by broad terms such as mental health creates more distrust in the application of law, as our current administration tends to fill specialist positions with cankle cronies rather than listen to true health professionals. And that brings us back to intoxication and instability. When you're intoxicated, whether from alcohol, weed, or anything else, yes, your judgment is impaired. That's why we don't let people drive under the influence. But if intoxication equals instability, and instability equals disqualification from our Second Amendment, then we're saying anyone who drinks, smokes, or uses any mind-altering substance shouldn't be allowed to own a gun. That would disqualify millions of American adults. So if we followed that logic, nearly the entire country would lose their Second Amendment rights. According to the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, 58.7 million adults experience some form of mental illness. Of these individuals, 20.4 million also had a substance use disorder. 48.5 million people aged 12 or older had a substance use disorder. Among adults with many or any mental illness, 42.4% used illicit drugs in the past year. This number jumps to 51.9% among those with serious mental illness. That's why this can't be a federal issue anymore. The federal government needs to take a step back. The federal government in this administration tries to infer causation with no substantial evidence. Instead, it's truly correlation. Lawmakers are not mental health professionals. That is one thing we have to be remembered of. And they're not behavioral scientists. Their job is to create laws, not to interpret human behavior through a political lens of bias. This is where specialists and data come in. This is why we have agencies, experts, and mental health professionals, people whose entire careers are built and dedicated on studying crisis behavior, not exploiting it for headlines. But because the truth is simple, gun violence will never fully disappear. Criminals will always find access, but restricting the rights of certain groups of people, marijuana users, transgender people, or anyone else, that's not going to stop gun violence. It's not going to stop crime. That's just discrimination hiding behind policy. So what's the solution though? It's not blanket bans, it's a case-by-case accountability. It's using due process the way it was designed to evaluate situations individually, not ideologically. Messed up on that word there. And yes, that means there will still be casualties. That's the unfortunate truth about living in a free society. But that's also what our justice system is for. to interpret disputes under the law, not to preemptively strip rights away out of fear or politics. So, when it comes down to it, blanket restrictions on gun ownership based on identity or lifestyles aren't just unconstitutional, they're downright un-American. And here's where the real unfairness kicks in. Because this isn't just about who can own a gun, it's about who gets punished for owning one, who gets criminalized, and who gets forgiven. Our justice system has never applied accountability equally. That's not an opinion, that's a fact backed by data. White people who commit gun crimes or other violent offenses often receive shorter sentences or plea deals that people of color would never be offered. Meanwhile, Black and brown Americans are disproportionately arrested, convicted, and sentenced more harshly for the exact same crimes. So, when we talk about restricting access to guns under the banner of public safety, what you're really doing, whether consciously or not, is handing more power to a justice system that already discriminates. If you ban marijuana users from owning guns, guess who's going to be targeted first? It's not the suburban white guy with a medical card. It's the Black man pulled over for a minor traffic stop. If you add transgender people to that list of banned people who cannot own guns legally, it's not about gun safety anymore. It's about social control. That's the deeper layer to this. The laws may not look neutral on paper, but the enforcement has always reflected bias. And until that imbalance is addressed, every new restriction, no matter how logical it sounds, will hit marginalized people first and hardest. So when we talk about gun rights, we can't just talk about access. We have to talk about application and, more importantly, no prejudice convictions for these crimes. Because a right that's applied unequally is not a right. It's a privilege. Here, I'm articulating something most people miss when they debate gun rights. And let me just preface this. I am not agreeing with Charlie Kirk's political framing. I am agreeing with a philosophical truth that's hard to swallow. Total safety and total freedom can't coexist. A balanced and pragmatic middle ground must somehow exist. Charlie once said that few gun deaths a year are worth it to preserve the Second Amendment. Now, I think the way he said that was callous, dismissive, and completely devoid of empathy, but the underlying truth is this. We can't completely eradicate gun violence. That's the cost of living in a free society. What we can do is build systems that hold people accountable, apply justice fairly, and prevent access for those who are truly unstable defined by professionals, not just politically unpopular and partisan talking points used to pander for a few votes in an election. Because restrictions doesn't always mean protection. Sometimes restrictions is just control dressed up as concern. If the justice system consistently applied fair sentencing without racial bias, without political favoritism, without arbitrary leniency, then you'd see a natural deterrent effect. People commit crimes when they don't believe there will be consequences, or when they see examples of the people like them getting away with those crimes, aka gun violence and mass shootings. Deterrence comes from certainty, not just severity. If people know that committing a violent act will lead to a fair but firm punishment, regardless of race or privilege, the rate of those crimes naturally drops. It's not that America has a gun problem, it has an accountability problem. It's not that we lack laws, it's that we apply them unequally. And when justice isn't equal, deterrence doesn't exist. It becomes performative. The right to bear arms is meaningless if justice isn't applied equally. And that's where our focus should be, not by taking rights away from the vulnerable. So when we talk about gun violence, when we talk about how to prevent gun violence on human beings, on children, on people going to grocery stores or people going to school, it tends to miss the point. The natural deterrence to gun violence is applying justice fairly and making sure these sick individuals who choose to end lives are imprisoned for a long period of time with no chance of getting out. That is how we deter gun violence. It will never be eradicated, but we can deter it with actual fair punishments and serving sentences to the maximum. Anyway, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of the Civil Point podcast. If you haven't already, you can definitely go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And before I do, just remember that gun violence needs to be talked about. But we need to talk about, is it the guns? Yes, because they kill people. Is it the people? Yes, because people kill people. But we also need to talk about the larger issue at hand and the deterrence that could play a greater effect in gun violence deaths when we apply our laws to the maximum extent for homicide and mass murders. We need to hold our justice system accountable just as much as we hold the criminals and the guns accountable. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you guys have an amazing night. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. This is The Civil Point with none other than me, your host, Ariana Dieva. I will catch you on the next episode. Bye.